Welcome back to my channel. In today's video I am taking on a Jaguar X-type ball joint replacement, but with a unique twist. Unlike most videos out there, I'll show you how I added wheel camber adjustment, a key modification to help prevent excessive front tire wear. If you are dealing with uneven tread wear or planning suspension work on your Jaguar X-type, this video is a must-see, so let's get started. I began by choking the opposite front wheel to prevent any movement. Then I removed the wheel on the side where the ball joint needed replacing. I first loosened the lug nuts, raised the car with a jack and then removed the nuts completely using a lug wrench. With the wheel off, I slid two wooden pellet cubes under the brake rotor and gently lowered the car onto them. That leveled out the suspension, an important step to take the pressure off the anti-roll bar link so it could be unbolted safely. I broke free the 16mm nut using a socket. Once the link nut was off, I shifted the ABS sensor cable bracket aside and carefully popped the link out of the strut ear. Next, I raised the car with the jack and placed two pellet cubes under the front subframe for safety. Throughout the whole repair, I was using these cubes in two ways, placing them under the brake rotor to level the suspension when needed, and under the front subframe for safety whenever the suspension leveling wasn't required. With the car raised, I began removing the plastic splash shield to access the front control arm bolt. I unscrewed all the clips holding the splash shield in place, including an improvised bolt and nut fastener I used to replace the lost tab at the front end of the shield. Next, I broke free and unscrewed the 18mm nut securing the ball joint. I preferred to do this while the control arm was still firmly held in place by its other fasteners. Now it was time to remove the control arm bolts. I started by loosening the rear hydro-filled bushing nut. You may find videos online where guys just press the control arm down to remove the ball joint, but I prefer to remove the bushing bolt first, especially after having had a bad experience with oil leaking from the hydro-filled bushing. By the way, the Jaguar handbook recommends lowering the entire front subframe when working on the front suspension. I found a way to skip that step while still taking all the necessary safety precautions. As you might have noticed, the bolt securing the hydro bushing is installed from the bottom up here, whereas the car originally comes with it installed from the top down. I cannot recommend you change the factory setup, since I am not quite sure if it affects safety, but I chose to thread it from the bottom up because it's easier to be removed during the front suspension repairs. With the bolt unscrewed, I needed to lower the car onto the pellet cubes to level the bushing holes and allow the bolt to slide out. Since I had already removed the front bushing bolt, I temporarily inserted it to keep the control arm in place while lowering the car. Here I am showing you how I unscrew the front bushing bolt. I actually did this before removing the rear bushing bolt, and that turned out to be a mistake. It's better remove this bolt second, after the rear one. That way I wouldn't have to put it back temporarily just to slide the rear bushing bolt out. The same goes for the brake calipers. They really should have been removed earlier in the process. But I'm not a professional mechanic and luckily I don't have to replace the Jaguar X-type ball joint very often, maybe once every few years. So I hope you will forgive me less than perfect sequence. I unscrewed and removed the two bolts securing the brake caliper as a whole. Then I rotated it slightly around the rotor to press the brake piston back in and took it off. To keep it out of the way, I hung the caliper on the front spring using a wire hook. After that, I pulled the front wheel steering knuckle slightly outward and freed the control arm from its position. The clearance in the CV joint gave me just enough room to do this. At that point, the only thing left was to knock the bolt out of the ball joint clamp and separate the bolt stud from the steering knuckle. As you can see, the ball joint is secured with bolts and nuts, since I had already taken it off earlier. In just a moment I'll show you how the camber on the Jaguar X-type can be adjusted, so stay tuned. Before removing the old ball joint, I spotted the positions of the retaining bolts with a permanent marker. That way I can preserve the wheel alignment when installing the new ball joint. I unscrewed and removed all 3 bolts holding the ball joint in place. It was seated tightly, so I had to knock it out with a hammer. As you can see, the bolt holes are elongated. This let me adjust the wheel camber. I notched them with a round file toward the engine bay to allow the front wheels to be pushed inward. Of course, I didn't do the alignment myself. I just let the technician know that camber adjustment was possible on my car. The idea of making the front camber adjustable came to me when I saw how it was done on some Volkswagen models with adjustable ball joints. But I didn't want to take the risk of modifying the ball joints themselves. Instead, I felt it was much safer to upgrade the control arms, especially since control arms are replaced far less often than ball joints. So halfway through the job, it's time for a little break, because really there are 3 things you can watch forever: fire burning, water flowing and the cat's human heart at work. After that I moved on to installing the ball joint. Although it came with all new fasteners, I prefer to reuse the old ones, and here is why. Remember those marks I made before taking the ball joint apart? I wanted to make sure the bolts go back exactly where they had been before to maintain the correct wheel alignment. So I installed the new ball joint exactly in the same position as the old one, making sure both had identical dimensions. Then I tightened all the fasteners securing it. With all that done, the control arm was ready to go back in. This time I did everything in reverse order compared to when I took it apart. I inserted the ball joint stud into the steering knuckle clamp and secured it with a bolt, pushing it in from the rear of the car toward the front. After that I pulled the steering knuckle outward slightly to raise the control arm and align the bushing into their spots. The CV joint clearance allowed me to do this. At one point the tripod yoke slipped out a bit too far, but thankfully the rollers inside stayed in place. I carefully guided them back to their housing. First I inserted the front bushing bolt and screwed it in just enough to hold the control arm in place. Next I inserted the hydrofield bushing bolt from the bottom up. Of course, with the car raised on the jack, it couldn't be fully installed yet, so it was time to lower the car onto the wooden cubes once again to bring the suspension components back into alignment. I had to use a pry bar to press the bushing into place, gently tapping the bolt in with light hammer knocks. Once the bolt was in, I screwed the nut on top and tightened the fastener securely. I held the nut in place with a 17mm spanner, while first tightening the bolt with the ratchet and finishing it off with a T-wrench for a secure fit. I raised the car to relieve tension on the suspension, then screwed in the front bolt without fully tightening it. Next I installed and tightened the ball joint retaining nut with an 18mm socket. However, I had to lower the car again to insert the anti-roll bar link into the strut ear and screw a 16mm nut on the ball stud. Now, with the suspension level and the control arm horizontal, I also tightened the front bushing bolt. This step is really important. It helps to prevent the bushing from wearing out too quickly. Now it was time to reinstall the brake caliper. I took it down from where it was hanging and mounted it back onto the steering knuckle using 2 bolts, tightening them with a T-wrench. Finally, I raised the car with a jack, removed the cubes from under the rotor and put them back under the subframe. I had to tighten the anti-roll bar link completely. I held the stud steady with a hex key and tightened the nut using an adjustable wrench. The final step was to reinstall the splash shield. I secured it using the clips and my improvised bolt and nut fastener at the front end. The ball joint was replaced. Done and dusted. To cut a long story short, I skipped showing how I put the wheel back on and lowered the car off the jack.